right, we are recording. My name is Karin Berkowitz, and I am the Executive Director at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We're so happy to be joined here by our colleagues from Middlesex College, who will be leading our discussion today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Democracy Conversations Project, or as we call it fondly around the office, DCP, a new initiative to explore civic life and democracy in New Jersey by convening discussions among community members. For this series, NJCH has partnered with 8 of New Jersey's excellent community colleges, each of which will discuss a topic of importance to all New Jerseyans as we think about civic life here in the Garden State and beyond. We are eager to explore not only our present circumstances, but how the past has led us to where we are today, and how we together will create the communities we wish to see in the future. The Democracy Conversations Project is a part of the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I would also like to thank the New Jersey Council of County Colleges for their support of this program. This program is closed captioned, so if you do not currently see the closed captioning and wish to, please enable it on your Zoom using the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment during the program, please use Zoom's chat feature. We will start off with a few short presentations, then we will get to questions and comments, but I will be moderating the chat throughout the program. Also, NJCH is live tweeting this event, so we encourage you to follow us on Twitter and use the hashtag DemocracyNJCH, and you can certainly get involved in conversation there too. NJCH is thrilled to partner with Middlesex College for this program, Demographics and Disinformation. I'm delighted to introduce you to our moderator this morning, Franklin Halperin, who is an adjunct professor of history at the college. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the Zoom screen over to Franklin to get our discussion started today.
Thanks so much, Corin. Good morning, everybody. I'd just first like to thank the New Jersey Council of the Humanities, especially Gigi Naglek, for awarding us this grant and giving us this opportunity to discuss these critical issues about democracy. And I also just want to thank the administration at Middlesex College, especially Yamilet Fibo Gomez, the Director of Grants, for guiding us through this whole process. And also just want to add really quickly that Middlesex College is having our spring open house this Sunday, April 18th, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And you can register for that at our website, middlesexcc.edu. So now on with it. I'm Franklin Halperin. I teach history here at the Department of History and Social Sciences, and I'm a PhD candidate at Rutgers University's Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Today we have 4 panelists, each of whom will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. The first 2 will discuss demographics, and then we'll transition to disinformation with the other 2. As Corin said, we'll field questions from the audience at the end, but certainly if you think of a question while the panelists are presenting, feel free to drop it into the chat at that time. So the first speaker today is Ashley Koenig. She's the director of Rutgers University's Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling, a statewide university-based survey research center. A political scientist by training, Professor Koenig specializes in American politics, women in politics, and research methodologies. So Professor Koenig, whenever you're ready, take it away on demographics.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. And thank you to Middlesex College for inviting me to be a part of this talk. I'm honored to be on the panel with all of you. And so you know my exact location right now, I'm actually about to receive my second shot. So I'm talking to you, even though I have this lovely blue background, from my car. So if I have to hop off early because of that, I hope you'll excuse me, and I apologize for the overbooking. But both of these things are definitely important. So let's get rolling into some demographics. So I wanted to start off and show a few slides and talk about the demographics overall in our electorate, as well as what we saw in 2020 is to kind of kick off our conversation. I'm gonna just pause my video so I can share my screen. I saw a meme going around where everybody was saying that the thing that everybody says nowadays is, I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see this? Which seems to be true. I feel like I say that every day, multiple times a day now. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see this. Let's talk about some of the demographic patterns and shifts that we've seen. And as Franklin had said at the beginning, the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling is part of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. We are one of its 2 oldest centers, and we are home of the Rutgers Eagleton poll. If you see our statewide New Jersey public opinion research out there in the news, we've been around since 1971 and are the oldest and longest continuously running university-based state survey research center in the United States. Let's start off with age. There are some pretty important demographics that we all know about and we talk about every single election cycle. And so I wanted to go through some of these kind of more common demographics that we talk about before Andrew dives into some actually deeper demographics. So let's start out with age and generational effects. What do we know? What has gone on, especially within the past few election cycles? What are we as a population? And even more so, what are we as an electorate in America? So millennials and Gen Zers have become increasingly larger portions of the population in the next, and will increasingly become so within the next few decades. And actually 2020, the 2020 election cycle, is the first time that many members of Gen Z, Americans who we would consider being born after 1996, were able to participate in a presidential election. 1 in 10 eligible voters this year are actually, or this past year, are members of Gen Z, which is up from 4% in the 2016 election cycle. So generations are certainly shifting. Of course, we know that this kind of eligibility, even though we see more eligible Gen Zers, we know that this eligibility, though, does not automatically translate into registration, or of course, does not necessarily translate into turnout. And we actually, even though we did see eligibility and actually millennial eligibility dip down slightly, we do see familiar patterns when we look at what happened in 2020, both projected and actual, in terms of who actually was predicted to vote and or voted. So for example, if we're talking about Pew Research Center put together some predictions in 2019 and 2020 of what the electorate looked like. And so we see that we actually have an aging electorate. Voters are getting older. The median age among all registered voters actually increased over the past several decades from 44 in 1996 to a median age of 50 in 2019. And this is happening in both of the parties, although of course more so among Republicans than Democrats. You can see that Republicans are slightly older than Democrats are. And as we know in typical demographic patterns, we do see younger voters more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans. In voter turnout, we saw some, in the actual turnout on election day, we saw some interesting numbers, especially with the highest voting group coming from those who are 30 to 49, highest turnout among that 30 to 49 bracket, followed closely by those who are 50 to 64. What's interesting is when we're comparing this back to who was projected to be part of the electorate in 2020, we actually see that those 30 to 49-year-olds are a couple points higher than they were expected to be, as well as the 50 to 64-year-olds. And in contrast, those 65 plus people, that group actually being slightly lower than what they were projected to be, most likely playing into the patterns that we saw and the actual increase in support for Biden, especially among those who are middle-aged and slightly older. We also know, though, like I said, we do have the Gen Zers coming up at the millennials as well, with more and more becoming eligible, especially when we even look back one election cycle to 2016. And of course, Biden did win among these coveted slots in terms of the 30 to 39 and the 40 to 49-year-olds. He won pretty handedly among these two groups. Let's turn to gender. Of course, we know that there has been a long discussed gender gap in politics ever since the 1980s. And we've seen this gender gap widen over the past several decades. We know that this gender gap exists both in terms of eligibility and registration, in terms of who and how they register, as well as in terms of how they vote. Excuse me. So we see the gender gap widening in terms of vote choice, or the percentage of the Democratic vote share, over time since the 70s. But what's interesting is we actually did not see this gender gap rise to even greater heights when it comes to 2020. And while it's still debated exactly what those numbers may be, we do see that the 26 looks like it was one of the peak for the gender gap, except not the greatest year for the gender gap, and then the gender gap actually slipping somewhat in 2020. And we do know that females are actually a majority who turn out, and of course decisively gave Biden a win within 2020. We also have a rapidly diversifying electorate. As we can see here, we see that the number of non-white voters has been increasing over the last several decades. This is especially true when we're talking about the Democratic Party and those voters who are non-white, siding mostly with the Democratic Party. In terms of actual voter turnout, we do see that Black and Latino both at 13%. The Hispanic Latino vote actually predicted to be even slightly more than the African American vote this year, although pretty much on par once we saw the final numbers from 2020. We know that historically, though, we know that non-white voters have always leaned Democratic. What's interesting is we started seeing in 2020 some patterns of shifts in unexpected directions. In terms of among white voters, we know that especially the non-college educated white vote, if we're talking about the Sun Belt, if we're talking about the Midwest, we know that particularly propelled Trump to victory in 2016. But Trump actually lost ground with white voters in 2020. This was leading up to the 2020 election, but this is what polling had shown thus far among voters of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. By the same token, we actually saw Black voters and Hispanic voters move slightly in the direction of Trump, especially among particular groups, especially with men, especially depending upon education and especially depending upon age. And of course, we know that once again, white voters had gone for Trump 58 to 41, but there had been inroads in the 2020 election that propelled Biden to victory, given where those inroads were taking place, especially within key battleground states, such as the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania areas, as well as looking at Arizona and Georgia. And like I said, we did see some notable shifts in the final exit polls. We did see that white voters were slightly more likely to vote for Biden than they were for the Democratic candidate than for Clinton back in 2016. We also saw, though, again, that reverse pattern of non-white voters, Black voters, Latino or Hispanic voters, as well as Asian American voters, slightly less likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than they did in 2016. We should also recognize, though, that none of these groups exist on their own in terms of how the demographics and how the social identity of a particular group interacts with other social identities of an individual. And so, for example, we again see major differences when we look at the intersectionality of education, gender, and race, particularly in the battleground states. If we're looking at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, as well as Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. We talk about this all the time with demographics, that demographics are not a monolith. While we may try to analyze them as such, demographics, obviously, there are a lot of intricacies and details that happen among each one of these groups. And we saw this with the Hispanic vote in Florida in particular, especially concentrated in the Cuban American vote that was argued to have propelled Trump to victory in Florida. And by the same token, we see this with the women's vote when we divide this by race and ethnicity, and the differences among racial groups, with Black women overwhelmingly going with the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates, as opposed to white women who are consistently going for or leaning in the direction of Republican candidates more so than non-white voters. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew to talk about some more demographics.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? one of the things I wanted to focus on, and I want to thank Ashley for her presentation, is some of those groups that are overlooked in presidential elections. We talk a lot about the Latino vote. We talk about a lot about the white evangelical vote. We talk about, college education, things like that. But there are some groups that I think are overlooked. And one of the major groups that I wanted to focus on is the Asian American community. Now, as we know, the Asian American community has gone through, many changes within the last year. Obviously, if you look at the increase in hate crimes among Asian Americans in the midst of the coronavirus, the Asian American community, might say, is under attack. But again, as compared to Latino voters, we really don't dive into the Asian vote that much. And Asian Americans are of course, part of the growing diversity of America. And as Ashley said, if you looked at the numbers, Asian Americans were 61% Biden, 34% Donald Trump. But as with any ethnic group, there are differences, okay? Asian Americans are not a monolithic group by any stretch of the imagination. So if you were to break down the numbers a little further, you would see that people who were Korean American, who were Japanese American, who were Indian American, who were Chinese American, much more likely to vote for Biden than they were for Trump. If you look at the Vietnamese population or a Vietnamese American population, if you look at the Filipino American population, they were more likely to vote for Trump, giving more of an anti-China stance. One of the major reasons why you don't see a lot of outreach, or in comparison to the Latino voter, is Asian voter turnout tends to be pretty low. Okay, it was under 50%. Under 50% of Asian Americans who could vote in 2014 actually voted. That number has increased substantially by 2018. It was up roughly 13%. So if you look at voter turnout, again, when you increase the voter turnout by 13%, you are definitely having, an increase, presence in the election. The other thing I think that, besides the fact that a lot of Asian Americans are considered monolithic, is the fact that we generalize that Asian Americans really don't live in battleground states. Okay, that is obviously not true. If you look at states like Florida, if you look at states like Arizona, okay, if you look at, for instance, Pennsylvania, all right, 8% of Pennsylvania's population is now Asian American. All right. If you're talking about 8% of a population, that is going to have an impact on presidential politics. All right. So, again, I think that if you look at a lot of groups that are underestimated or underrepresented, when we talk about, groups that matter in presidential elections, definitely Asian Americans fit into that category. The other category that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, and I had mentioned this group in my intro, was the white evangelical vote. And we spend many, and if you look at media coverage as it relates to voting patterns, you can see that there is a heavy emphasis on the white evangelical vote. And if you look at the white evangelical vote, you will see that it was roughly 25% Biden, it was 75% Trump, which is not surprising if you look at the issues that they are concerned about, particularly issues of the Supreme Court, anti-abortion, issues such as that. Even the mainline Protestant vote was roughly 40% Biden, 60% Trump. Again, probably not a big surprise. But we really don't focus on other religious groups at all. One of the groups that came up, of course, this semester, not this semester, but came up during this past presidential election. As some of you know, Joe Biden is Catholic. And the Catholic vote you might find interesting. It was actually 52% Biden, it was 47% Trump, which you might say, wow, that's only 5 percentage points. It doesn't seem like a big gap. And really, in hindsight, it's not. However, though, if you look at the Catholic vote a little deeper, you will see that white Catholics, it was 44% Biden, 56% Trump. Now, obviously, if you look at demographics overall, white supporters pretty much for almost every category supported Donald Trump. All right. But obviously, if you're talking about non-white Catholics, you know, they obviously had an impact in terms of voting for Biden over Trump. Okay. And you know, and there are issues of, you know, so again, so you see another major split between white voters and non-white voters in terms of in terms of their voting behaviors. Okay. The other religious group that is predominantly Biden was the Jewish vote. It was roughly 80-20. All right. And that obviously is a big difference. Okay. But again, I think we sometimes overly focus on the white evangelical vote without focusing on the other particular groups. All right. The last group that I wanted to talk a little bit about was the LGBT vote. Now, again, to some people, that is not a sizable community, but it does really have an impact. If you looked at the LGBT vote, it was roughly 67% Biden, 32% Trump. Again, probably not a surprise given the whole issue of you know, transgendered individuals in the military. If in the non-LGBT vote was roughly split 50-50, okay. Yeah, 32%, okay. But again, so you see again a 17 or 18% difference in the LGBT vote versus 32%. You know, in terms of the LGBT vote, again, was 67% Biden, 32% Trump. Some people would argue that number was a little high. I personally think that number might have been a little higher than I would have expected. The non-LGBT vote was roughly 50-50. I believe it was 51-48 or somewhere around there. But again, my point is that we tend to focus again on certain groups more than others, when we really should also be looking at some other groups that potentially, again, can have an impact on elections that we just don't normally think about. So I'll pass it on to whoever's next.
Thanks, Professor Derision. I'll jump back in at this point in time. So that was Andrew Derision. He's an assistant professor of sociology at Middlesex College, specializing in the white supremacist movement, specifically the development of white supremacist ideology. So something that struck me that kind of flows through both of these presentations is, you know, to what extent there's a relationship between demographics, one's identity, and voting patterns, voting behavior. So I'd like to put a question out there real quick, starting with Professor Koenig. You know, we're seeing an increasingly diverse electorate in this country, but why does it not necessarily automatically translate into consistent wins for Democrats? Because that seems to be an assumption that some people make.
Issues over here. Of turnout, right? Elections are about turnout and getting.
We're losing you a bit. You're jumping in and out with your connection.
What we see in national polling doesn't necessarily.
I'm sorry, Professor Koenig, we're not hearing you right now. We'll try and circle back around to it in a little bit. If you just keep us posted as to how your connection is doing. Real quick, Professor Derision, why don't we just turn to you and then we'll transition into the next section. Do you think there's some other overlooked groups in terms of election results, since we're still talking about the relationships between demographics and voting? What do you think about that?
Yes, I think there are two groups, again, that most people don't think about. One is related to religion, and that is the atheist community. As you know, overall, America is becoming a less religious society overall, or as I sometimes say, we're a little bit of a combination religion society where we take little bits of religion and kind of create our own faith pattern. The atheist vote is another vote that, again, people don't really think about. I don't have the 2020 number on me as we speak, but in 2016 the number was roughly 80% Clinton, 20% Trump, which again is a very high number. Okay, related to that are the voters who believe in the separation of church and state. Again, they were more likely to vote. They are more likely to vote Democratic than they are Republican. Okay, you can see where, again, when it comes to religion, we tend to, I think, overly focus on white evangelicals without realizing the religious diversity that we really have in this country. And again, I think to focus on white evangelicals is a little too focused, if you were to ask me.
Great, got it. That's really interesting. It looks like we've got Professor Koenig back, so let's circle back around again. Professor Koenig, want to take another swing at that regarding the diversification of the electorate and the extent to which that does and does not translate to consistent Democrat wins?
Technology is great. So what I was trying to say last time is essentially, we have a couple of different factors, right? Eligibility doesn't translate necessarily into who is registered. Who is registered to vote doesn't necessarily turn into or translate into actual voter turnout. And that could be a number of things. It's a turnout game, right? We talk about different parties mobilizing their party bases. Just because there's a numbers, it is a numbers game, but it depends upon the numbers, right? Just because we have a number of groups, non-white voters mostly, younger voters mostly, who side with the Democratic Party, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to turn out to vote. So what becomes most important approaching any election is the turnout game. And frankly, whether with nefarious intentions or not, any type of voter suppression game. On top of that, we also have to recognize the Electoral College. I think when we see these national polls, part of what pollsters have been trying to do is talk about and put into the discussion that national polls do not equate how our elections are won. I actually was doing international news on election night and trying to explain this to an international audience about our Electoral College. Obviously, the statewide polls do a much better job of mirroring the Electoral College and how elections are won in the United States than national polling does. National polling may tell us the mood of the country, but elections are won and lost by states, and we saw this very clearly in the several weeks after the election, as the nail biters of Georgia and Arizona and Nevada were coming into play. So these battleground states are exceptionally important. And so it becomes more about the people within those states. And of course, for elections in general, it also becomes about districting and redistricting and gerrymandering. So there are a lot of different influences that makes the equation or the path not so straight between registered to vote and then turning out to vote.
All right, so let me just hit you with one more while we still have you, especially since you just made a distinction between a few different kinds of polls. So thinking about how we know what we know, right? Where does polling succeed in capturing some of these demographic differences? And where might it fall short? And then how can we do better moving forward with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Professor Derision was also talking a lot about this when we were talking about these smaller groups that are just as important to analyze, but unfortunately because of statistics, because of time, because of money, the constraints of every researcher, time and money. It becomes very hard to actually study these groups that are nonetheless exceptionally important. Polls on the one hand, in terms of the good, polls do a whole lot of good by giving a representative voice to the people in proportion to how they are in the population. It is, I like to romanticize about it in a way where it is probably the only participatory tool, the only political act in which people will be represented, even if they didn't participate, in proportion to how they are in the population. All we ask is for you to fill out a survey or to answer a phone call or complete something on the internet. You don't really need a whole lot of time. You don't need to take off work and attend a rally. You don't have to take time and write a letter to a member of Congress. It is a very, very simple act. And the people who turn out are not just the people who get represented. The people who are represented in a poll, again, are representative of the entire population. It's the beauty of the statistical underpinnings of polling, of how we generalize a sample back to an entire population that we are studying. But there are downfalls also, because we're dealing with samples and sample sizes that are maybe 1,000, a couple thousand, often more likely several hundred with a lot of these polls. And we saw the pitfalls of this, particularly in 2016 and 2020. That means that smaller groups do not get represented as much, or can sometimes not even be interpreted with any statistical confidence, because they are just so small in our sample. And this always comes down to Asian Americans, interpreting numbers on Asian Americans, interpreting numbers on the LGBTQ community. If we're talking about a sample size of 800 people, 1,000 people, and their percentage in the population is single digits, we're talking about groups that are probably, under 10%. Under 100 cases in a sample that we can't really analyze. And so that's where it becomes difficult. That's where the giants of survey research like Pew Research Center do a phenomenal job and invest a ton of time and money that most researchers don't have into analyzing these specific groups, so that we hear their voices in an amplified and appropriate way, rather than only analyzing the biggest groups in a typical survey. And so, there's a lot of conversation now around diversity and inclusion, and within the polling industry, about how we become more inclusive of these kinds of demographics moving forward in our polling.
Franklin, I wanted to interject just real fast, if I could, just for 1 second.
Yeah, real quick.
One of the issues I forgot was the whole issues of identity politics. I know that's a very much a buzzword right now. If you looked at the 2020 election, you generally see, if you looked at the voting patterns, people were more likely to identify with their racial or ethnic group than they were with their gender per se. So although we talk a lot about identity politics and the intersection between race and gender, again, if you looked at the 2020 presidential election demographics, you see that overall people were much more likely to still rank their racial identity as higher than their gender identity, which I always think is an interesting pattern.
Right, noted. All right, great. That was really great. Thank you so much to the both of you. So at this point in time, since we're talking about understanding groups of people and how this relates to their decisions, how they vote and participate in civics, this is a good point to transition to the next portion of our conversation on disinformation. So with that, we turn to our first speaker on this topic, Nicholas Archer, an assistant professor of political science at Middlesex College. He specializes in American politics and political theory with an emphasis on American political development. And he's going to speak today on the processes by which disinformation are disseminated on social media and what public policy strategies are available to combat it. So Professor Archer, if you please.
I'll start off by saying, I think in the plenary meeting before this, we actually said my colleague, Professor Rotolo, is going first, because I sort of have the second portion of the meal here. So I think you should let him go first, and then I'll do what I have to do.
Sure, we can switch that right up. So let's turn to Professor Giuseppe Rotolo for the moment instead, who teaches philosophy at Middlesex College. And his interests include philosophy of the mind, object-oriented ontology, and postmodernism and political philosophy. And today he's going to explore how lies and misinformation spread through media and why do people fall for it. And then we'll also try to understand what we as individuals can do to prevent disinformation from disrupting further our society and democratic process. So Professor Rotolo, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you for having me here. I wanted to thank briefly Professor Corrigan, who organized this with us, and Professor Archer specifically to inviting me to this. So I want to start today by telling you a little story. So recently in Italy, there was a decision by the equivalent of the Supreme Court that made many people in the journalism realm and some academic circles a little bit uneasy. The court decided against a journalist working for Repubblica, one of the most read newspapers in the country, in a case that I believe is emblematic of the times in which we live. Sylvie Coyed, the journalist in question, pointed out that a series of medical treatments that some doctors were selling as cures for COVID-19 were scams, and that these doctors, that while selling this stuff were advising people not to take the vaccine, should be considered charlatans and have their medical license revoked. Well, the doctors took the journalists to the court on the grounds of defamation, and the court sided with them. The court decided that the doctors were doing what we're doing was not illegal, the treatment didn't kill anyone, and that denouncing them as charlatans was punishable for the journalist. So the journalist now has to pay a hefty fine, and she's also out of a job. This dispute, which can be understood as a dispute over different belief systems, has become now a matter of policy in Italy, and many people are siding one way or the other. In the United States, obviously the situation is a little bit different, but we do live in a similar divisive climate. Telling somebody that they're following some fake news, that telling someone there's a conspiracy theorist and so on, are now pretty much standard official ways in which people curse at each other. But regardless of the way, regardless of who you talk to, I should say, there's something that everyone seems to agree on: the fact that lies and misinformation spread through media, and especially social media, and that this disinformation is particularly pernicious and difficult to identify and protect against once they take hold of an individual or a group of individuals. Now, how does such disinformation spreads though? Why do people fall for it? And what can we do to prevent it to disrupt further society and democratic process? These are kind of the questions that I'm going to try to answer today. I'm now going to start sharing my screen and show you a quick PowerPoint. So again, just like Professor Koenig before me, I'm just going to try to see if you guys can see this. Can you see this?
Yes.
All right. All right. Perfect. So whenever we consider these things, we tend to, the first instinct that we have is to believe that there's a certain group of people that, for one reason or another, has decided that the truth is not important, that there are no facts, but just interpretations. And this is reasonable because different people are drawing different conclusion, completely different conclusion. It doesn't seem like that we are drawing subtly different conclusion from the same evidence. It seems that different intellectual communities no longer share basic foundational beliefs. And it seems that political affiliation has replaced basic reasoning skills, that we've become trapped in some sort of echo chambers or own making. Or maybe it seems like we live in an intellectually impenetrable layer of like-minded friends and web pages and social media feeds. That seems to be the trend. But what is true is, it seems to be at least that there is a disruption of the way information flows. And this disruption comes in different flavors, we can say. And today I'm gonna try to analyze two of these flavors, and they're called epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. So Let's start with epistemic bubbles. An epistemic bubble is an information network from which relevant voices have been excluded by omission. The exclusion could be there for a reason, of course. We might be avoiding contact with some views because they make us uncomfortable. We like to engage in selective exposure, we know, seeking out information that confirms our own worldview rather than contradict it. But sometimes the omission can also be entirely involuntary. If we're not actively trying to avoid disagreement, our Facebook friends tend to share our views and interests. After all, this is why they're our friends, right? When we interact with networks built for social reasons and start using them as our information feeds, we tend to miss out on contrary views and run into exaggerated degrees of agreement. Echo chambers are different. They work by systematically alienating their members from all outside epistemic sources. Where an epistemic bubble merely omits contrary views, an echo chamber brings its members to actively distrust outsiders. Recognized example of this will be Alex Jones, OAN, and the late Rush Limbaugh, of course. Their attacks on mainstream media are attempts to discredit all other sources of knowledge. They systematically undermine the integrity of anybody who express any kind of disagreement with their views. Outsiders are not simply mistaken. They are malicious, manipulative, and actively working to destroy the way of life of the host, right, of Alex Jones or OAN at all, and their followers. The worldview that results from this is one of deeply opposed forces, an all or nothing war between good and evil. Anybody who isn't faithful follower of the doctrine expressed is clearly opposed to the side of right, and therefore absolutely untrustworthy. So in epistemic bubbles, other voices are not heard. In echo chambers, other voices are actively undermined. It is worth it to take a longer look to the structures. So let's start with epistemic bubbles again. The general gist. We get much of our news from Facebook feeds and similar sorts of social media. Our Facebook feed consists mostly of our friends and colleagues, the majority of whom share our own political cultural views. At the same time, algorithms behind the scenes invisibly personalize, obviously we know that, right? Our searches, making it more likely that we will see only what we want to see. These processes all impose filters on information. Such filters, though, we have to understand, are not necessarily bad. The world is overstuffed with information, and one can't sort through it all by oneself. Filters need to be outsourced. That is why we all depend on an extended social network to deliver us knowledge. But any informational network needs the right amount of sameness and variety in order to work. Otherwise, we're in trouble. It is like if you're a music fan, when you get your music through apps like Spotify or Apple Music, after a while, if you really like an artist there or a genre, you will end up seeing suggestions of artists and music that is eerily similar only to your original choice. Basically, you will start listening more and more to copycats of your favorite artist. But you might miss out on some great music because you just get no news of it, right? If social network composed entirely of incredibly smart, obsessive country music fans will deliver all the information I could want about the country scene, though it could fail to clue me in to the fact that, say, a large number of Dumbo octopi have taken over the Jersey Shore. Each individual person in my network might be superbly reliable about their particular information patch, but it doesn't deliver to me a sufficiently broad and representative coverage of all the relevant information. Epistemic bubbles threaten us also with a second danger, excessive self-confidence. In a bubble, we will encounter exaggerating amounts of agreement and suppress level of disagreement. We are vulnerable to this for good reasons. In fact, we need to pay attention to whether people agree or disagree with us to look for corroboration. In fact, this is a basic method that we have for checking whether one has reasoned well or badly. But of course, not all forms of corroboration are meaningful. Luckily, though, epistemic bubbles are easily burst. We can pop an epistemic bubble simply by exposing its members to the information and arguments that they have missed. But echo chambers are far more pernicious and robust phenomenon. The echo chamber doesn't need any unbalanced flow of information to function. Echo chambers inhabit and have full access to outside sources of information. Alex Jones followers or OAN viewers regularly read but do not accept mainstream and liberal news sources. They're isolated, not because they're missing information, but by changes in who they accept as authorities, experts, and trusted sources. They hear but dismiss outside voices. Their worldview can survive exposure to those outside voices because their belief system has prepared them for such intellectual onslaught. In fact, exposure to the contrary views actually reinforce their views. Let's say Jones might offer his followers a conspiracy theory. Anybody who criticizes him is doing it at the bidding of a secret cabal of evil elites, which has already seized control of the mainstream media. His followers are now protected against simple exposure to contrary evidence. In fact, the more they find that the mainstream media calls out Jones for inaccuracy, the more Jones predictions will be confirmed. Perversely, then, exposure to outsiders with contrary views can thus increase echo chambers' confidence in their insider sources, and hence their attachment to their worldview. What's happening is a kind of intellectual judo in which the power and enthusiasm of contrary voices are turned against those contrary voices through a careful, rigged internal structure of belief. To be clear, politics is not the only place where you find echo chambers. The world of anti-vaccination is a clear echo chamber, and it's one across all political lines. We can encounter echo chambers on topics as broad as diet. Think of veganism or keto diet, breastfeeding. Some academic circles are, academic traditions are definitely echo chambers, and there are so many others. So the first thing we should ask ourselves, how do we know if some belief system is an echo chamber? Here's a basic check that we can do. Does a community belief system actively undermine the trustworthiness of any outsiders who don't subscribe to its central dogmas? If so, then it's probably an echo chamber. One might be tempted to think that the solution is just more intellectual autonomy. Echo chambers arise because we trust others too much, so the solution is to start thinking for ourselves. But that kind of radical intellectual autonomy, we know is a pipe dream. We are heavily dependent on each other in almost every domain of knowledge. Think about how we trust others in every aspect of our daily life. Driving a car depends on trusting engineers and mechanics. Taking medicine depends on trusting the decision of doctors, chemists, and biologists. Even experts depend on vast networks of other experts. Modern knowledge depends on trusting long chains of experts, and no single person is in the position to check up the reliability of every member of that chain. Just simply ask yourself, are you able to tell a good nuclear engineer for a bad one, a good biologist from a bad one? Probably not, right? And maybe we can answer positively to one of these questions, but not to all of them. We depend on a complicated social structure of trust. We must trust each other when it comes to knowledge. But as philosopher Annette Bayer says, that trust makes us vulnerable. Echo chambers operate as a kind of social parasite on that vulnerability, taking advantage of our epistemic condition and social dependency. Unfortunately, though, most people, when looking at what is happening with social media and media in general, have instead tried to explain what is happening by blaming the other side, of abandoning the search for truth and a refusal of facts. And to be clear, it is tempting to do so. It seems that the truth no longer matters. But this is an explanation in terms of total irrationality. To accept it, we must believe that a great number of people have lost all interest in evidence or investigation and have fallen away from the ways of reason. The phenomenon of echo chambers offers a less damning explanation. The apparent post-truth attitude can be explained as the result of manipulation of trust produced by echo chambers. We don't have to attribute complete disinterest in facts, evidence, or reason to explain the post-truth attitude. We simply have to attribute to certain communities a vastly divergent set of trusted authorities. If we listen to what it actually sounds like when people reject the plain facts, it doesn't sound like brute irrationality. One side points out a piece of economic data, the other side rejects the data by rejecting its source. They think the newspaper is biased or the academic elites generating the data are corrupt. An echo chamber doesn't destroy their member interest in the truth. He merely manipulates who they trust, and he changes whom they accept as trustworthy sources and institutions. And in many ways, echo chambers members are following reasonable and rational procedures of inquiry. They are engaging in critical reasoning. They are questioning. They are evaluating sources for themselves. They are assessing different pathways to information. They are critically examining those claims and those who claim expertise and trustworthiness using what they already know about the world. It's simply that their basis for evaluation, their background beliefs about who they trust are radically different. They're not irrational. At this point, the question that we should try to answer are, how can we make sure that we are not in an echo chamber? And can we help someone who's in one? And if so, how? But luckily, I'm well out of time, so I don't have to give you any of these difficult answers. And I will try to reappear here and to stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Professor Rotolo. This idea of the intellectual judo and that self-reinforcing issue is really concerning, maybe. But let me try you on one of those questions you just gave us at the end. What do you think? If it's true that most people are within their own contexts, doing their due diligence and checking the facts, aren't we doomed to this eternal disagreement and divisiveness? Or can we really get out of these echo chambers?
Oh, the answer that comes to my mind immediately is probably, but I don't want to say that. Now, I think there are ways in which we can get out of this. And actually, this idea is not a new idea. This problem that we have is not a new problem at all. If you go back even to ancient Greece, right? Socrates had problems with the sophists. He didn't know how to work that. And more representatively of the situation in which we are today, there's probably the example of Descartes. In 1640, this philosopher writes this book called The Meditation on First Philosophy, and he uses this methodology. At some point, he figures out that a lot of his knowledge comes from things that are not trustworthy. A lot of his knowledge is wrong. So what he does is he pretends that everything that he knows is absolutely wrong, and he rejects everything. And he does this sort of cognitive reboot, we can say, right? And maybe this is the way in which we need to do this. Maybe we need, first of all, ourselves to do this reboot and put ourselves, how can we say, in play again and rethink all the things that we believe. And I'm a philosopher, so I kind of do this all the time. So, but I know it's not easy, right? And the other thing is to help others. Maybe we need to help them go through this reboot. Nobody can do this alone, right? There are examples of people that get out of echo chambers eventually. And it seems very similar to the way in which people get out of cults. The psychology behind being part of an echo chamber seems to be very similar to the one of people that are part of different cults, pretty much. So maybe we need to go in that direction. And there, again, I can give you a couple of examples of specific people that got out of it. There was this neo-Nazi young man that was prepped by his father to become the neo-Nazi guy, and went to school and openly a neo-Nazi and everything. And eventually, while telling him that what he believed in was wrong, didn't work. What worked was this Jewish guy that kept inviting him to dinner on Sabbath. And after millions of times of this person being genuine and nice to him, he started doubting the fact that all Jewish people were horrible, right? And eventually this jump-started his rebooting. Now, it's not always that easy, and I'm describing like it was an easy thing, probably wasn't. But, you know, the problem is this element of trust, and trusting people is not easy, right? And we believe the people that we trust because they give us something more. They don't give us just expertise. They give us this trustworthiness, which makes connect to these people on a personal level. So that's important.
Great. Well, it's good to know it can be done. So now that we know that, we're well positioned to move back to Professor Archer now, who again will be speaking on the processes by which disinformation is disseminated on social media and what public policy strategies are available to combat it. So now, Professor Archer, if you please.
Hi all. First, just want to thank everyone who got this thing organized, both with the financial capital and just the organizational capacity for it. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Rotolo, because he, I think, in some ways, did me a favor in that I don't think I'm going to have to spend too much time on, how social media creates these disinformation problems and their spirals. I think he actually did a fairly good job of providing that framework. And more, what I want to focus on is, tangible policy solutions to that. What do we do about this, dilemma that we're clearly in, right? So what I'm going to do first is put a little historical context to information dissemination in the United States and fears of extremism and all that, before then going into, well, what are some concrete, perhaps realizable ways we can deal with disinformation on social media and perhaps the internet more generally. Okay. Unfortunately, I do not have the fancy graphics and GIFs that he had or the demographic information, but I'll just ask people to politely follow along, and I will try to be as brief as possible, understanding our time constraints. So, writing near the end of the Second World War, then Vice President and radical progressive Henry Wallace tried to make sense of the phenomenon of fascism and how it might or did manifest itself in the United States. Quoting directly, he noted, "The obvious types of American fascists are dealt with on the air and in the press. These demagogues and stooges are fronts for others. Dangerous as these people may be, they are not so significant as thousands of other people who have never been mentioned." Going on, he said, "The dangerous American fascist is the man who wants to do in the United States in an American way what Hitler did in Germany in a Prussian way. The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money or more power. If we define an American fascist as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States." So I want to go back here for a second, a couple of lines previously, just because I think this is an important point. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money or more power. And again, I think we can look back at the last 4 years and start to see, how this, to some of us, ancient quote has relevance to where we're going, or where we are and where we're going. Wallace thus found the root of and potential for the growth of fascism in the information, or rather disinformation, propagated by oligarchical interests through mass media they owned and the bigoted mouthpieces they employed. The fight against fascism was then, in his view, a scramble for the power of media technology over the public mind. And he urged America to increase its, quote, liberal potential and articulate a better vision of democracy that attacked and dismantled vested economic interest as well as organized hate in the country, in the larger world. So I'll just point out very quickly here, it was not long after that was published that the Democratic Party removed him from the vice presidential slot on the ticket for that year in favor of the far more conservative Democrat, Harry Truman, which is interesting to think about. At any rate, the next 40 years or so seem to nominally validate his vision, at least in the context of mass media. And here I'm talking about this increasing our liberal progressive potential. Steep caps were placed on the amount of media one entity can own. An equal partisan time doctrine was applied to the airwaves. Communications regulatory agencies were nominally run by civil servants, not the corporate media moguls they were to regulate. However, starting in the 1980s with Reaganism, these rules and regulations began to be gutted even as cable and digital communication technology advanced at a rapid clip, ever more and more ubiquitous in the daily life of the American citizen and consumer. Now, I imagine that there could be some quibbling on this, but to me, as someone who studies American political development, especially along these lines, the greatest moment of infamy in this process was ironically created by a Democratic president and a Republican Congress with the passing of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which essentially obliterated the remaining caps on media ownership in the United States, as well as the passage of the Communications Decency Act in the same year, which among other things shielded internet service providers from legal liability for the things their users posted, no matter how violent or vile. And this not only included neo-Nazism, but child sex abuse images, terrorist manuals. If you're old enough to remember the halcyon days of the internet, it was pretty easy with a little know-how to find some pretty disturbing stuff, right? It is through these laws that we have to come to and have not only the so-called big tech oligopolies that define 21st century cyberspace, but also the social media app ecosystem that has played so much havoc in the spread of disinformation and done the most to help with the retrenchment and growth of fascist sentiments amongst a large amount of the American population, again, in particular, the already predisposed conservative elements of it. Again, rather than, how apt that I included this in my little script without even knowing everything he was going to say, but rather than repeat anything my colleague has already said about how, this disinformation process works, generally and in social media in particular, and to avoid getting caught up in the myriad of horrible examples people are all too familiar with, I would like to instead focus on solutions to the dilemma of disinformation, especially the more right-wing fascistic disinformation, and ask, relative to Henry Wallace, as a nod to him, how we can increase our, quote, liberal potential in the social media ecosphere. So I dismiss outright the argument made by many progressives as well as GOP elites about breaking up these big tech companies as unfeasible relative to function. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I'm saying here is as long as these apps exist as information mines tied to a profit motive with generous legal liability protection, there is a disincentive for these companies to reliably police disinformation that would hurt profitability. Every person you boot off your network is less data that you can then mine, turn into a consumer profile that is then passed on to advertisers, right? Truth be told, and again, you saw, up until very recently, a lot of social media companies professed a doctrine of free speech absolutism. Anything goes, and we're not going to moderate little to anything at all. And you can understand, well, that would make sense. So you're not being held legally liable for what's being published, and you want to maximize your user base to gain their data, to sell. So, taking that out of the equation, the sort of antitrust argument per se. Instead, I want to focus on two other solutions that have been proposed at by various people and in various places. The first one being nationalizing social media companies into a public utility, or the second option, repealing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that provides internet company with these legal liability shields. The former argument, advocated by progressive magazines like Jacobin, as well as the Green Party and many socialist organizations, uses the theory of natural monopoly, which states any service that becomes essential to a society's function ought to be expropriated into a publicly governed utility, democratically governed in some capacity. According to this argument, a government-run social media ecosphere would be more apt to have responsible moderation and content guidelines than a for-profit click-driven model ecosphere does, and would give better speech protections to vulnerable communities. And I think some of that who that might be was covered in the demographics part of this panel. Casting aside American Cold Warrior fears of state media and big government, and understanding that privacy is already dead in the public and private sectors, evidenced by the Snowden leaks 10 years ago, the biggest problem with this concept is that it would not only give the quote unquote marginalized better speech protections, but it would also strengthen speech protections for the fascist elements who have wreaked the greatest amount of havoc in society, as public entities are subject to greater scrutiny under the First Amendment than private corporations. Coddling bigots on libertarian grounds may be a very American thing, but it also seems to undermine what we want to aim for in an actual democracy. The next argument, repealing Section 230 of the CDA and holding companies liable for their user speech and behavior, is one most associated with Trump and other fascists themselves, but is also nominally supported by Joe Biden and an increasing number of liberals and progressives. To the Trump involved, repealing Section 230 would, in their mind, allow them to sue Twitter and other app companies for censoring their bigotry out of alleged liberal bias. Such a claim is dubious, as a repeal of 230 would in no way apply First Amendment protections to corporations, something that is deeply ingrained in our speech law and our larger legal structure. In all likelihood, it would have the opposite effect, getting companies to quickly delete and ban information and users engaging in hostile and illegal acts and advocacy for fear of lawsuits or criminal charges. This could, of course, as you'll hear, lead to leftists and other types of groups also falling under stricter scrutiny, even for factual grievances. But this ignores the reality that such things always happen, regardless in a capitalist country, to leftist groups, and that some level of mild gatekeeping of bad information has always been assumed necessary in democracy, long before even Henry Wallace implied so. If anything, a repeal of 230 may destroy the comprehensive news and entertainment ecosystems social media has created, along with the cognitive distortions elevated by them. Here I always, when I discuss this in other places, do we really need to get our news, sports, information, pornography all in one place? Or does having that type of information delivery system, fundamentally screw up our mind in terms of recognizing fiction, reality, appropriate behavior? I think there's, a big question on that. Perhaps as we repeal 230, we will return to the pluralistic days of a cooperatively governed, distinctive web form and blog-based internet that characterized digital development prior to 2009. There may be other options yet conceived or to be discussed, including revising American speech doctrine to be similar to that of Western Europe in terms of prohibiting fascist propaganda and organizing. Regardless, if we do nothing to combat disinformation on social media and elsewhere, we will continue to destroy our liberal potential and guarantee fascism a permanent sway in the public mind. And that's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Professor Archer. So it seems like there's a good amount of agreement that there's a problem here, but a lot of disagreement on what to do about it. So before we turn it over to Q&As from the audience, let me just ask you real quick. Can social media ever be a net social good? You were talking about the halcyon days of the internet. Are there any positives to be gotten out of it here at this point in time?
This is, Professor Rotolo and I, this seems to be an endless conversation between us and the things we tend to read. I'll say this, social media, just like the web forums of my youth, and I'm dating myself now, can create instances of community. And community to me never can be something that is fundamentally a digital thing, but rather an organizing space for in-person interaction sometime down the line. I'd be remiss to say if, most of the friends that I've made in the last 10 years have become, been through Twitter and Instagram, right? But we also have to understand that there's just the profit motive tied to this, ultimately, provides an incentive to reward the worst behavior, right? The best tweets are never the ones that make a profound point about the nature of man, but the insults, right? And that cult of hostility, even among what are supposed to be like-minded individuals. The algorithms of these apps are tweaked more and more to push that content even higher, because again, clicks, retweets, all are translated into more data and profit in the end. So as long as profit is tied to social media as an institution, you can expect things to get invariably worse, in my opinion. And again, I am not unsympathetic. It might seem in my talk that I was a little unsympathetic to this idea of nationalizing company, the social media ecosystem. I'm not really. I think it would be the ideal solution, but you have to accompany that by also dismantling the free speech absolutism doctrines that America rests itself on now. Right? There's an acknowledgement in many other democracies that, the paradox is, if we're going to have a tolerant society, we can't tolerate intolerance. People who are actively trying to destroy society or bring it back to the Stone Age really shouldn't be getting a platform, right? At least in a public sense. So again, that I think that is part of the conversation as well. That's a hard choice that most Americans who are so militant about this, whack job idea of free speech we have aren't willing to touch. Yet, I believe we will have to touch it, and sooner rather than later than we think.
Great, thank you for that. So that being said, in the name of democracy, inclusion, and having conversations, this is a good time to turn it back over to Karin to field some questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Frank. And I think I'm actually going to follow hard on the heels of what you just asked, because a lot of what I'm seeing from the few comments that have been posted publicly in the chat and that people have messaged to me have to do with exactly this question of how do we fix what's broken? It seems to me that each of you in your talks identified something that was broken, whether it was echo chambers or difficulty polling across intersectionality in small groups, or a social media system that appears to be destructive rather than constructive. So I guess to all the panelists, and here I'm kind of merging some of these questions, how do we break out of what is not working? How do we find representation for those people who are hardest to represent in polling, in order to fix that system? And then on the social media side, or the information side, how do we go about, Giuseppe referenced Descartes and sort of going back to our roots of knowledge, right? And reconstructing, breaking free of our trust networks and reconstructing what it is we know and trust. How can we do that kind of a reboot? How can we move outside of the spheres that seem to encase us at the moment?
Are members of the audience allowed to answer this question?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay. I just believe, since from hearing what you guys are talking about, I feel like on a level, the best solution would be to update information. You know, you're talking about voting and why people don't believe that voting is important, or there's not enough information about it. Well, obviously, a lot of people don't go on to go to college or higher education and stuff. So rather, if we broke it down in like high school classrooms more, or we made it a requirement that, you know, there has to be a class that teaches you what's the purpose of voting, how to do it, how to register, all this, like practical skills. And the same thing with social media, like having a class that helps us understand what's the good parts of social media, what are the bad parts, how to look at it, how to break it down and see what information is really valuable and what is leading you to not be able to, it's leading you to bad information, like you were saying before. So I guess that would be my suggestion.
Can I piggyback on that? So one of the best classes I ever took in high school, and again, I'm not dating myself with a year, but was one called Visual Literacy in Television, which tried to do, at least through television, you know, because that was the dominant medium at the time, you know, like try to make sense of these things. What are they telling you? What are the, you know, the profit interests behind this? You know, how is a media narrative on television, constructed and to whose benefit, right? You know, we need more. Again, I doubt anyone here, given where we are, is going to say education isn't a key component of it. But I would say that relative to what you just said and relative to just my own experience, I mean, I took that class with me the rest of my life. We don't just need education, we need critical education. We need an education that gets us outside of Americanism and says, who are we as just citizens of the world beyond these nationalist identities that by themselves cloud our judgment and the judgment of the information spheres that we consume. So, I will always, put better education and critical education as one of the key things we need to, promote, fund, and construct if we're going to fix any of the other myriad of problems we're dealing with.
Right?
Great. Yeah.
So I'm going to go a little bit against the grain here, I think. I think the problem is we need to, partially against the grain at least, we really need to rethink what we mean by education. Because as George said something like, well, we need more practical things, right? We need this hands-on experience on how to register, how to do that. Well, that's not difficult to learn. That you can learn anytime. The problem is we're going too practical with education. We're teaching kids, starting with kindergarten, we can say, that they need to find a job and that's it. That's what we're doing. And this is why technical education, scientific education, that's all we promote now. And everything that's not that seems to be bad, seems to be useless. I mean, the humanities are almost useless by, if you read those things, right? And of course, I don't agree with that. And I'm assuming most of us here don't agree with that. So I think that instead we need to let kids be more creative with the way of thinking, because problem solving comes from creativity. Problem solving comes from a different perspective, instead of making them into this automaton that will eventually end up working. Again, the place where I work, we do this as well. We're always thinking when assessing programs, what are the learning outcomes are important, but what kind of job can a student do after he graduates in this? What is the educational, what is the occupational outcome of this? And all these things are great. But again, these things are the things that have brought us to these issues, because now we have data, we look at the data, and we don't know what to do with it. Because we got run into a problem and we're like stuck with it because we have no creative ways of thinking, and it takes exceptional people to do that. And again, I'm not saying that everyone can be exceptional, but at least we can all start thinking differently if we reform the educational system in a way that, how can we say, promotes, we can say, the good life rather than a life of work and that's it.
Andrew, it looks like.
Yeah, I think to get back to the demographic information just for a second, I know I had talked about the overlooked groups, and I think in the media in general, and I include social media in that, we are so hyper focused on certain groups. I mean, if I read one more article on rural voters, I mean, okay, I get the rural voter, I get the Midwest voter, I get that. But we have a fascination with certain groups over others to the exclusions of groups that can matter. And we don't focus on those groups. And, you know, as Ashley had said, you know, getting data on them is incredibly difficult. Well, we need to try to start getting data on more than, you know, voters who live in Iowa. I know a lot about Iowa now. I don't need any more Iowa stories. You know, it becomes repetitive after a while.
Well, and one of the things that brings to mind for me, connecting your talk with Giuseppe's, is that if we're always focused on a specific set of stories, right, we're missing other stories. We create information bubbles of things that we know and things that we don't know. And politicians respond to those stories too, and to the information that they have. And so then suddenly, those people whose stories get told more have more power because politicians are responding to those. So I think what I'm hearing today, at least, is in all of these talks, is that we need to push ourselves to move outside of what we happen across in the world. And I just love, George, I love what you said about sort of getting people involved and educated at younger stages, getting them, you know, familiar with the idea of voting and why it's important, and thinking about their lives as members with voices of a society, right? I know we're coming close to the end of our time here today. Does anyone else want to unmute? It looks like we've got some people posting in the chat that they have some more thoughts. We can take another question or two, I think, before we wrap up. And then just a reminder, and I will remind you again before we shut this down, we're going to continue along these lines in a week. So, Catherine, do you want to go ahead? I saw you just posted something in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and throw out maybe a condensed version of that question? It looks like you have a multi-part question, so maybe stick to one part of it.
I mean, I could just read it. I speak fast. I'm just talking about, Professor Rotolo said that there was, the skepticism was to some extent reasonable, that some people doubted science, some people doubted academia, but after being told by an adult real person that all science was fake and academia was run by a pervasive secret organization of Jews and Israelis that were aimed after world domination, I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think they're really mentally there. I kind of disagree with that, and because it's way past Alex Jones level, and the potential inaccuracy in one source, the nuclear scientist, that's not very good. That's why you check several sources. That's why you get a few nuclear scientists. You look at a few different studies. And thirdly, you can't really escape the echo chamber until you like leave the echo chamber. You have to physically remove yourself and seek a new group of people. And something I've noticed in people is that racists often haven't met or really talked to a Black person, and without their bias in mind. It's kind of crazy too. Like once you, what another professor had said that about the white supremacist who had met the Jewish man and found that he was actually so nice. It's kind of like that. They've never actually met a person and realized that they were a person. And about free speech, I think that, because I've seen liberal echo chambers, they're very strange, they're very censored, and I think it's a very slippery slope to thought crime if you eliminate freedom of speech.
Thank you for those comments. Can we get quick feedback from the panelists? And then let's also remember that I just want to encourage everybody to come back a week from now, because I think we've just begun to unbottle some really weighty issues, and we will be hard pressed to resolve them in just a few minutes, but we have at least another hour to try a week from now. So quick responses from the panelists.
So real quick, I think that what I'm saying is not that being, I think that skepticism is always a good way of looking at things. It doesn't hurt anybody to doubt things are out there. That said, I said that the majority of people that live in echo chambers do their own research within the chambers, though, right? That's the problem. And the solution, I can guarantee you, because it's an echo chamber and not an epistemic bubble, it's not telling them that they're wrong and shout at them that they are mistaken, because that will reinforce their idea. This is why I was saying that we need to tackle this in a different direction. Also, we want to be careful what we wish for, because it sounds to me that if there's nothing we can do, what do we do with these people? We put them in jail? We cast them out? What's the solution? We want to be careful, because the road to secession, it's really close if we think in those terms.
Just to her second point, I'm not arguing eliminating free speech as an entire category or having the government, regulate every aspect of speech. But I would, ask a rhetorical question: is Sweden a totalitarian dictatorship? Is Italy a totalitarian dictatorship? Is France a totalitarian dictatorship? I think most comparative politics analysts would say no, not by any stretch. And in many ways, they are far more democratic, and at least within the last 30 years have far better human rights records than the United States. And I have to attribute some of that to the fact that they legitimately crack down on, for lack of a neutral term, the scum of the earth, and say, the people who believe Jews are running the world need to be executed. They don't get a public platform. That doesn't mean you put them in prison. It means that, you just don't give them that public square to shout what they want to shout at, right? And again, I think, I get this argument from, ironically, a libertarian philosopher named Karl Popper, who said the paradox of tolerance is that a tolerant society cannot tolerate bigots who want to destroy the society, because if they do, if they give them a platform and a foothold, well, we've seen what's happened in Germany. We've seen what happens across Latin America. We see what's happened in the United States and Russia and everywhere now, right? So, I do think, we have to make some, we have to, going back to this rebooting, reweighing the absolute rights of the individual versus the collective choices and sacrifices needed to meaningfully have democracy. I think these things cannot be divorced, and we've fallen too much into individual self-righteousness and the right to be a troll. And as far as I'm concerned, bless my late mother, she said, you don't have that right. And I think we need to take that seriously. So I think that's about all I have.
On that note, if I could just jump in, we are at 11:30 now. So let me just say thank you again to Karin for all the hard work you did today, to Gigi and the entire New Jersey Council of the Humanities, as well as the Mellon Foundation and everyone at Middlesex College and all the audience here today. This was a really great conversation. And don't forget that In the Weeds follow-up so we can talk some more. So, and then having said that, I would just offer it back to either Karin or Gigi for the last word.
Thank you so much, Frank. And I'm just going to echo without a chamber your thank yous to the panelists and the audience for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording now.